Hello, everyone. My name is Gitika Gorthy, and today I'm very, very excited and honored to be interviewing a very special space champion, Dr. Andrew Williams. Dr. Williams works in external relations at the European Southern Observatory and is co-lead of Policy Hub for the International Astronomical Union Center for the Protection of the Dark and Quiet Sky. He is also ESO's representative to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, an executive board member for the EU-funded Project Attract, and research affiliate at the Center for Space Governance. Recently, Dr. Williams was named one of the top 100 men to follow in aerospace and aviation on LinkedIn. He uses his platform to talk about space policy and governance, shedding light on the future of space diplomacy. I was very excited to read about Dr. Williams' profile on LinkedIn and to learn how he combined his different passions together to do what he does now, which is what he loves the most. So I'm very excited to learn about Dr. Williams' journey and how he navigated his path into space policy. So welcome, Dr. Williams. Thank you so much for taking your time to inspire the next generation of aerospace leaders.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Katika, and it's really great thing that you're doing here to share all these interviews from such a wide range of space people on YouTube. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, to just kick off our conversation, I always start off with, what does your typical day look like? Usually nobody has a typical day, but what's the general structure of your day?
Yep, so you're right in that there is no typical day, but there are some things that are always constant. So the first one is I always deal with the children in the morning, which is a really nice way to start the day. I always try and exercise for at least 1 hour first thing. So then usually my mornings would be kept free for doing the planning and the difficult things. I think it was Mark Twain who spoke about, you've got to eat the frog first and then everything else seems easy after that. So I always try and do the kind of deep work first, and then it's emails. And then I usually schedule my meetings in the afternoon. And this is either meeting with my team, meeting with the various project teams that I'm on, often many external people. I've had some meetings with journalists recently to talk about the recent UN event. And of course, quite a lot of travel because I'm traveling around various places and having meetings. So I think that's the as much as I can say about a typical day.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're able to still balance that time and, make sure you spend time on yourself and with your family. I think that's incredible. And, one of the things when I was reading about your background that I was really inspired by and also really excited to hear was your involvement with the United Nations. A lot of times when people think of space, it's definitely not working with the United Nations or doing something internationally with different countries because space is so like political. It's so like militarized and defense based that people don't realize that space can also be this factor of unity and working together. And so I'm curious to learn a little bit more about your work with the United Nations and how you got involved with this project.
Sure. So I can certainly speak to that. So I think I need to give a little bit of background first. So you've mentioned my involvement in the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So this is one of the many UN committees, but it's the only one really that's focusing on space. And it started in 1958 with 18 countries. And actually it was the launch of Sputnik was one of the drivers really that prompted the setup of this committee. And then it was established as a permanent UN body in 1959, and its main focus is on international cooperation in outer space. And in fact, it's one of its original mandates is to consider legal questions about space exploration in addition to the international cooperation for peaceful purposes. So in 1967, I hope I've got the date right, this committee, which I now call COPUOS, created the Treaty on the Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, otherwise known as the Outer Space Treaty. And this is a multilateral treaty that forms the basis of international space law and basically the governance of outer space. And that's essentially what COPUOS does. So it's the international forum where we can talk about the overall governance of everything outer space. And over the years, it's really grown, and it now has, I think, over 100 member states. And there are also many observer organizations, and this is now where I come in. So my organization, the European Southern Observatory, it's an intergovernmental organization. So it means it's founded on a treaty which countries have to ratify to sign in order to join. And we have the right to observe the UN COPUOS committee. So part of my duties working for ESO in external relations is that I'm our representative in this committee. So for the past 7 years or so, I've been acting as ESO's representative to the committee, which is really one of the most fascinating roles that I have. So you may ask, well, what is a ground-based astronomy organization doing in this space committee? Because that's what ESO does. We build world-leading ground-based astronomy telescopes, and our current project is building what's called the Extremely Large Telescope. It's going to be the world's largest optical and infrared ground-based telescope. It's going to have a main mirror of 39 meters across, which is about 120 feet for those in America. And it's really going to be a revolution in astronomy. And of course, we're not in space, but we're looking up in the sky. And of course, we depend on the conditions in the environment that are in space. So there's a couple of advocacy things that we're doing at this UN Space Committee. So the first one is advocating for the fact that astronomy should be considered as a space activity. So the Outer Space Treaty that I mentioned earlier, it doesn't actually specifically define what a space activity is. And in fact, it doesn't even define what outer space is. So this has always been one of the debates that is ongoing in COPUOS. So we are advocating to treat astronomy as a space activity. And when you think that, well, we do scientific observations from space, like we've got the Hubble Space Telescope been operating for 30 years now, and of course the James Webb Space Telescope just launched last year. So we're doing this astronomy in space. We've got cases where astronomy is supporting the exploration of space. So if you think of any solar system mission where a spacecraft has visited a solar system body, absolutely guaranteed that mission will have incorporated a wide range of astronomical observation before the mission, during the mission, and after the mission to help plan, to help interpret the scientific data. And in some cases, it was really absolutely critical to the mission, such as the NASA Double Asteroid Redirect Test, DART, that smashed into an asteroid last year. And the ground-based observation campaign for this, was essential to the scientific mission because they needed to, determine if the asteroid was actually moved or not. So we have this overall kind of advocacy for treating astronomy as a space activity. And that then becomes useful, and I can mention this later, about the need to protect this beautiful environment that you can see here in my background. So there's some other interesting things that go on at the Space Committee. So in fact, actually, it was just coming up on 10 years now when an asteroid smashed through the atmosphere just over Russia in Chelyabinsk, and actually, caused sort of thousands of injuries, broke thousands and thousands of windows in this town. And we had not seen this asteroid. We were completely unprepared for it. And this actually prompted the UN COPUOS to create 2 groups. So one is called the International Asteroid Warning Network. Another one is called the Space Missions Planning Advisory Group. And this is an international collaboration of astronomy organizations and space agencies to basically make sure that first we are really prepared for observing and detecting and finding all the potentially threatening asteroids out there. And we have a big international collaboration to do that. So that's the IWARN, the International Asteroid Warning Network. And then the other one, the Space Missions Planning Advisory Group, this is more on the space agency side, making sure that we are prepared to develop a space mission to actually go out into space and try and deflect an asteroid just in case we need to. And that, of course, the NASA DART that I mentioned, that was one of the critical first ever tests of our capability to actually do this. So those are some of the things that are ongoing related to astronomy in this space committee. And then the last thing I want to mention is we're there because we need to make sure that the space environment, so you can see this beautiful night sky background behind me, we need to make sure that that is kept pristine so that we can do astronomy. So right now we have a large advocacy project to help protect the dark and quiet skies. So we've done a lot of work recently at Copious, trying to find ways to govern the overall development of space activities to make sure that they don't impede on this dark and quiet sky environment. So that is my work at Copious in a nutshell.
Yeah, that provided me with so much context. I honestly didn't have a lot of background knowledge on a lot of the astronomy activities that are happening, as well as the advocacy groups that are there that are already in place to protect our environment and to protect space exploration. So I was really mind blown with that was a great explanation of what ESO is doing, as well as kind of how they're working with the United Nations as well as other countries to make sure we have better practices in protecting our night sky. And this has been a recurring topic that people talk about, of like sky pollution, night sky pollution, and also the asteroid. I believe there was an asteroid that actually landed in Florida. I read somewhere that there was another asteroid that came down. So I think it's really, a critical topic, an important topic, and I'm glad that you're able to bring in that knowledge. And when you were speaking, I couldn't help but notice that you are so knowledgeable in both the astronomy, the science, but also the policy and communication side. And so I'm really curious to learn about your background, like your educational background. Are you do you have a science degree or like a policy law degree, or kind of what's your background that kind of got you to this type of role? I'm really curious because it seems that you have knowledge on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question to ask, particularly as the space sector is growing and sort of people want to know, well, like, how do you get into it and what sort of background do you need to have? And so for me, it was really astronomy and just curiosity about the universe. Like, this was the draw to wanting to work in the space sector. And I think in general, I feel that it is really important for humanity to understand our world, to realize that we're all basically the same species on this tiny sliver of air on a small rock in, the vast cosmic arena, sort of paraphrasing Carl Sagan here. So I, quite early on, I ended up doing a degree in physics and astronomy, and I wanted to go into the space sector. And at the time, I just didn't find the exact job I wanted, but I found a job in the defense sector in the UK, which is, it's often, as you mentioned in the introduction, about space being militarized. This is a sort of parallel activity to the space sector. And I was always really interested about how international cooperation works. And, I really enjoy experiencing other cultures. And quite early on in my career, I had the opportunity to apply for a job at NATO, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an alliance of basically Western countries for defense. And this brought me from the UK over to the United States. And, I was doing a sort of physicsy related job initially at NATO. And then I had the opportunity to work on a different subject in my first year, which was to help the military forces engage with United Nations agencies and non-profit organizations working in conflict zones. And I realized that physics was not really so helpful for this type of role. And I started looking for some courses I could do, and basically ended up enrolling in a PhD program in political science with a minor in international relations. And from this PhD program, I began to understand, how do organizations really work? How do complex organizational systems work? How do political systems work? How are conflicts resolved? How do policy issues evolve and grow? And as my career with NATO grew, I was doing this PhD, and I found ways to have a kind of cross-pollination between the ability to understand the technical subjects that we were working on with this understanding how to govern them, how to regulate them, and how the policy world evolves. And after a while, I started again think, well, okay, this is a really fantastic job that I'm doing, but I still want to be in the space sector. And after a time, I started to look at various positions, and eventually the job at ESO came up. And of course, this is astronomy, so this is what got me started in the sector in the first place. And the job was, dealing with relations with our member states, doing the representation at Copious. And I thought, yes, that's the job for me. And then the rest is history, as they say.
Wow, yeah, I think this is what I love about the space industry. It's because it's so interdisciplinary. You could, have a fascination for space and practically combine it with any other subject, whether it be policy, communications, art, medicine. Like I'm interested in space medicine. So you could practically combine any topic with space and there is a career there. I remember the other day I was talking with like a fourth grade classroom and one of the girls like, I really love making and eating food. And I was like, have you considered becoming a food scientist at NASA? And she was like, that's a real career. And it's just surprising how you can combine so many different careers together, so many different topics together, and there will be a place in the space industry just because it's so interdisciplinary. You can't just major in space or astronomy.
Yeah.
In astronomy, you could, but not just space in general. You have to have like a specialty, and space is so interdisciplinary. You could combine so many of these topics together, and so I'm really glad that you were able to kind of still keep your passion for astronomy, but combine it with something that excited you a little bit more as well in policy and governance and find that perfect match. I think that's just like a testament to how interdisciplinary and how
Yeah.
fun and exciting space
So
is.
that's something I think that is really now becoming apparent in the space sector, is that, now many companies, not just ones that are typically space companies, but lots of companies on Earth are starting to think, okay, what is our space strategy? How are we going to leverage the new capabilities of Earth observation or communications, or what are the implications for us? So I think there's so much opportunity now, and so many different companies and ideas and problems and issues that are emerging that I think that there's a job for everyone and every interest.
Definitely. And this is more of like a sillier question, kind of less serious about space policy. A lot of times I hear like a lot of students, even young professionals and adults at conferences talking about the future of colonization on Mars or the moon and what that looks like between countries. Do you see, like from your personal perspective and opinion, what are your thoughts on if a country goes to Mars first? And obviously, I'm not sure if one country will go or it'll be every country collaborating together, and I'm pretty sure it will have to be international cooperation to go to places like to send humans to Mars and to colonize in a place like that. But do you see there being a international cooperation to going to Mars? And also when we start colonizing these other celestial bodies, will we need to create a law for that, or how do you think how are we going to go about that? Because I feel like it's all unknown territory, it's all very mysterious, so I'm curious to get your thoughts on this.
Yes, I mean, this is I think one of the most fascinating questions in a way about our future in space. And the Mars question hasn't yet come up so much at COPUOS, for example, which is currently, this is the sort of international forum for space governance, but the moon question is emerging. And, right now, there is an ongoing debate about, whether the existing moon treaty is actually valid. So this is something that COPUOS did in the 70s. They created a treaty to sort of initially govern how lunar activities could work, and it didn't get many signatories. And there's been various initiatives. For example, you've probably heard about the Artemis Accords. So this was started by the US and is now accumulating like-minded countries, creating a set of basic principles to try and kind of deconflict national activities in the lunar zone. And I think that, this could act as a template in a way to inform how future activities on Mars could develop. But I think that it's really not clear how we can deal with this on a truly global and multilateral basis, particularly when, we have, unfortunately, so much conflict going on in the world at the moment, and a really deep and broad difference of positions about how this should work between the West mainly and I'm thinking China and Russia. And until that gets resolved, I don't see how we can really have a proper global conversation about governance on Mars. But I think we still have plenty of time to figure it out, actually, because personally, although I think there's lots of enthusiasm, people get excited about, SpaceX, they're going to land on Mars in, X number of years. I think that X number of years is actually going to be a pretty long number. So I think that we still have at least a couple of decades before we really have to get serious about that. Whereas I think the lunar activity, that is going to be happening definitely in the next decade. So yeah, we need to work on that.
Definitely, yeah. And I think, I think I read somewhere that Elon Musk was saying like 2035, you're going to send humans to Mars, and it'll be like some other really, crazy number, which you never know because I feel like technology is advancing really fast, but also there are a lot of problems that we need to solve to get there. Not just the engineering side, but also the health, the medical side, the what are we going to do once we get there, the funding. There's a lot of, different challenges to get there. So definitely I agree that there are a lot of there's time to be able to figure out what's the best solution and the best steps to, make sure we come up with a global solution because the moon and Mars doesn't belong to anyone. So I think it's definitely a conversation that's important and we need to have, so we don't continue to make mistakes that we have in the past. And throughout your journey, I mean, we haven't really gotten to the main question that I wanted to ask you, which is what was the aha moment that inspired you to get into space? You mentioned you were always interested and fascinated with astronomy growing up, but what was that moment where you discovered, like, I love astronomy? Like, was there a moment, whether it be looking up at the night sky, watching a movie, was there ever a moment where you were like, this is what I want to do in the future?
So there was actually, in fact, there were two. So I always wanted to be a doctor, and that I selected my subjects actually in school, in high school, in order to lead to that path. And then just a bizarre sort of random chance, I was actually doing a Spanish language exam, and I was sitting in my high school in the language library, and just looking through the books, waiting for my exam to take place, and sort of buried in the corner, I found this book that obviously didn't belong there, and it was called Mr. Tompkins Goes to Wonderland. And this is a sort of classic kind of physics story about, it's written by George Gamow, I think it was the 1940s and 1950s. And it's basically about a guy who wakes up one day and all the physical constants are sort of on a human scale. So the speed of light is not, 300,000 kilometers per second. It's kind of 2 meters per second. So he gets to experience the effects of relativity sort of immediately, as he's cycling down the street on his bike. And I'd never known about any of this, and I was reading this book, and it was just sort of something inside kind of clicked, and I just became absolutely fascinated about it. And then I really started to sort of think about physics. And then sort of shortly after that, this was the spring of 1997, there was a comet that visited, the comet Hale-Bopp, and it was it was fully visible in the sky in the northern hemisphere for months, and a really, really amazing, spectacular comet. And I had the chance to see this through a telescope with my school, and this was just amazing. It was the first time that I'd actually ever looked through a telescope. And then that was the spark, and I actively started to seek out information on astronomy and space. And then I found Carl Sagan, and I watched his TV show. I read his books. I found Stephen Hawking. And then in my last year of high school, I abandoned my plan to be a doctor. And over the summer holiday, I did all the math. I did my maths A level, which is the degree that we have in the UK. And I changed my course and applied then for physics and astronomy at university. So that was the spark.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you went with that moment. I know it's, sometimes I feel like we all have that moment as a young child that like gets us really excited about space. And I'm really glad that you were able to find yours in high school and look through that telescope and experience that, find that book as well. This is why I say communication is so important, whether it be through movies, films, movies like Star Wars and TV shows like Star Trek. They make a huge impact on students because when you can see something and you just come across it and you never think about space, you're suddenly hooked, and it's hard to stop thinking about it. So I'm really glad that you found that passion and you like stepped out of your way to go pursue it instead of sticking with the path you already were deciding. And it would have been cool to see if you ever would have combined the medical degree with space as well, because that's how I got interested in space as well. In middle school, I had a rocketry club, and I built the rockets and fell in love with rocketry and realized that I love space. But I also loved biology. I loved chemistry. I loved medicine in general. And so I didn't want to pick between the both. And I discovered space medicine, and then found my path. But that's amazing to hear that you found this passion and you
Yeah.
stuck with it. I think that's
And
awesome.
the space medicine, I mean, I think this is a fascinating thing, right? We were just talking about going to Mars, and of course, for any sort of long journey, I mean, it has pretty bad effects on the human body. So we need to have people thinking about this. And if we're going to have space hotels, right, and there's a
Yeah.
medical emergency, I mean, you've got to have people who are medically trained in space. So yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting field that's developing.
Definitely. And when I heard that like Blue Origin, like Axiom Space, they're building commercial space stations, and they're going to be hundreds and hundreds of more scientists that are able to go to space. And honestly, just normal people who are not trained like astronauts today to be able to go to space, it's going to require a lot of medical understanding. So we make sure that everyone is safe and protected in microgravity environments. And so that whole side of research is so exciting. And I think there's a lot of potential for research and importance that's relevant research that's coming up, just because of how fast our industry is moving and how we're sending so many more people to space these days. Yeah, so my last and final question, now that we were able to learn a little bit more about your interests and your work in space policy, as well as your journey of how you discovered your love and passion for space, my last question for you is, what piece of advice do you have for young students regarding their pursuit of a passion in the space industry? Growing up, I feel like we tend to ignore a lot of things around us. And as we grow older, we're like, oh, I wish I did this, or I wish I knew this. What's a piece of advice you wish you could kind of time travel, and tell the younger version of yourself?
So I think the first thing to say would be, I think you said it at the start, is to take care of yourself. Relax, be healthy, exercise, don't watch too much TV, spend less time on social media, more time in social reality. And the one thing I would tell myself if I could go back in time was, really focus on your relationships with your colleagues and your friends and your people, because this, in the end of the day, it's not really your technical skill that actually matters most. It's your relationships with people in the workplace and in your life, and this is the most important thing. I think the second thing I would say is, people focus on a particular sector. So, even in the space sector, right, this might be like the launch sector, or, the development of satellites. And they might not focus on thinking about, well, how do I create value, and what am I actually good at doing? And this is because, there's many different opportunities to work on a skill to figure out what you're doing. So I think is another piece of advice is not to worry too much if you're not exactly where you want to be, but just to focus on developing mastery at something for a few years, and focus on finding out what you are actually good at. And then, life is quite long, and you'll have chances to move in the future. So, I do government relations and public affairs type work, and the basics of it are not that much different between sectors. So I was doing it in NATO, and then eventually I found a way to bring it into the space sector, and the basics of it are more or less the same. Of course, now I'm in the space sector, and that's much more exciting. Mm-hmm. And then another thing to say, it's kind of related, but it's good to have a passion, but I think you have to also be willing to try different things out, and realize that sometimes passion emerges from hard work on a problem that you weren't necessarily particularly interested in or passionate about in the future. So yeah, passion emerges. That's also good to know. Yeah, and then just the final thing to say would just be kind to people.
Yeah, I think that's incredible advice, a piece of advice that I'll definitely keep in mind, with first, like, making sure you take care of yourself as a student or even as a working professional. I think we're always trying to do better. We're trying to achieve more, and it's really hard to kind of step back and take care of yourself and to cherish the relationships that are in your life. And I think it's always important to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And also remember to be willing to explore and try new things. I've gotten this a lot of times where I would tell people I'm interested in space medicine, and they'd be like, "Oh, you still have so much time to figure out what you like." So, they would tell me, just make sure you try new things. And I think that's so, like, true, because I haven't experienced everything. So it's so important to keep my mind open and try new things, try new classes that I probably would never take, or think that I would never take. Like this semester, I'm taking art history, which has nothing to do with my major. But I thought it'd be, very an interesting class to take. So I think just always taking those risks, trying new things, seeing where, you might learn. And there's always ways you can bring in different skills to your true career or your true passion. You can pull from different subjects. And, I think your journey also was a huge, lesson for all of us, that, you can find your passion. It doesn't have to be immediate. And you can combine your different interests together to find that perfect career that makes you happy. So it was really inspiring listening to your journey, and also to listen to your advice as well as the work you're doing. So thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for taking your time to speak with us today. I learned so much more about astronomy as well as space policy, and I'm very excited to learn more and to continue to keep up with what the United Nations will do as we continue to explore further beyond. So thank you so much for your time today. I had a wonderful time speaking with you.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to talk to you today.